Back in the 80s, when literally anything could be turned into a Saturday morning cartoon, there was this little animation studio called Filmation. They were not the best animation studio out there by any means, but they did have a few hits, perhaps most notably the original He-Man cartoon. But in the later part of the 80s, they somehow got the bright idea of creating feature-length animated movies based on classic fairy tales. That's something you might recognize as the realm of a certain other animation studio. But to be fair, even though Disney did try to sue them, it was Filmation's own over-ambition that destroyed the company in the end. Filmation's final and most ambitious project was Happily Ever After, a sequel to the story of Snow White. And even though it didn't have a Disney movie budget, it did get a bit of advertising, including a game for the Super Nintendo. But that's not the game we're talking about today. Back in 1990, in the 16th issue of Nintendo Power, the magazine teased a NES game based on this movie, but it was never actually released. And since people barely even remember the movie itself anymore, much less the tie-in products, it's no wonder this game was more or less forgotten after a while. That is until 2016, when a fully working prototype of the game was miraculously found, presumably somewhere inside the warehouse from Raiders of the Lost Ark. So, now the question is, was this the 8-bit Snow White game that we had all undoubtedly been dreaming of? I mean, come on, I wasn't the only one, right? Anyway, here's the game. So, unsurprisingly, you play the game as Snow White, and your goal is to rescue the prince from every lazy sequel writer's favorite villain. That is, the sibling of the villain from the original. But hey, at least it's a female character rescuing a prince for once. The gameplay itself is pretty much what you'd expect from a platformer on the NES. You move and jump as expected, and you can attack by swinging Snow White's cape. It actually plays pretty well, though sometimes the hit detection feels a little bit off, and there was a couple of times where I was able to save myself from a fall by glitching into the edge of a platform. Still, for a prototype, it's pretty impressive, especially when you consider that the developers so far were much more famous for simulation games like Wall Street Kid. Apart from your standard platforming moves, you do have a few magical abilities. These are not attack moves as you might expect, but rather they're used to add a light puzzle element to the gameplay. For instance, if you come across a hole in the ground next to a high wall, you could use your water spell to summon a geyser to lift you over the wall. Now, these little puzzles don't turn up very often. In fact, most spells are only used like once or twice during the entire game, but it does at least add a bit of variety to the gameplay. Now, when it comes to the game's presentation, I'd have to say that's pretty good as well. Maybe not among the best on the NES, but still definitely above average. The sprites especially are very nice and detailed, and many of the enemies and bosses are based on monsters from the movie itself. The soundtrack is also much better than what you might expect. Most of the music is really nice actually, though it did admittedly freak me out a bit when I came to the cave level and heard the cabin music from the Friday the 13th game. But apparently both games had the same composer, so at least it's not plagiarism. And as far as I know, the rest of the music was written especially for this game. Though the map theme does remind me a lot of Princess Tomato in the Salad Kingdom. Which, by the way, is another NES game, just in case you thought I was starting to speak complete gibberish. Now, one thing that really surprised me about the game is how challenging it is. It's easy to forget these days, but back in the 80s and early 90s, it didn't matter if a game was aimed at 8-year-old girls. It was still going to be freaking hardcore. You get 5 extra lives, though they act more like a health bar with 5 hits. You do get 4 continues, but after that it's back to the beginning. And yes, I'll admit it, I did get a couple of game overs before I was able to beat the game. It is only 4 levels long though, so you won't have to go back too far. Happily Ever After might not be up there with, say, Capcom's or Taito's licensed games, but even disregarding its interesting history, it's still a worthwhile game experience. And since it's an unreleased game, you can even emulate it with good conscience. It's always sad when a game gets cancelled, but at least games like this show that there's always a chance for a happy ending. Perhaps you could even say a Happily Ever After.